We are catching up a little bit from John chapter 9. Thanks, by the way, Jeff, last week for adding some variety to our lives in the book of Micah. We're continuing now with, we're going to catch up from last week and then do our text this week from John chapter 9. So we left off in, verse 17 last week. So we'll jump into verse 18 this week. But before we do, a couple questions. Would you cast aside the truth to believe a lie? First question. I don't think many people, if you just ask them that question straight up, would you choose to believe a lie instead of the truth? I don't think most people would say, yeah, that's what I live for. I really want to do that. I don't think that they would. But I wonder if when pressed, if we do this more often than we would like to admit. For instance, when a loved one is about to pass away, we're pretty sure that they don't believe in the true gospel, in the true Jesus, and yet we really just like to believe that they're good, no big deal. They're going to end up in the same place that we end up, and we don't have to worry about them. And I wonder if sometimes in those moments the temptation is to cast aside truth and to believe a lie. When we're addicted, most certainly, we make this choice all the time to cast aside the truth and to believe a lie. Maybe it's not really a problem. Maybe people who are abused or traumatized believe lies because of what's happened to them. And sometimes this happens even when we identify the lie and see what it is, we still choose to live and act out of what's been done to us, to choose to cast aside the truth and believe the lie, maybe about who we are or about what we could do. Second question is this: are you willing to believe the truth no matter what it costs you? Are you willing to believe the truth no matter what it costs you? That's what we're talking about in John chapter 9. A guy who was blind from birth meets Jesus. So Jesus, this is the day after the Feast of Booths, Sabbath day, probably the final Sabbath day at the tail end of the Feast of Booths in John chapter 9. And Jesus passes by with his disciples. He's walking. He passes by a guy who's been blind from birth. And the disciples ask Jesus, we've already covered this in the story, disciples ask Jesus, who sinned, this man or his parents, that this guy would be born blind? And he says, you're focusing on the wrong thing. It's not about the cause for this guy. What it is about is the purpose. And the purpose, he says, is that the glory of God may be shown in this man. So in other words, Jesus teaches us, or he teaches his disciples, which in then turns comes to us through John's gospel, that iniquity in our life, a hardship, trial in our life, not always a direct punishment from God, not always a direct discipline from God, but it is the plan of God to bring about the glory of God in your life, maybe in my life. And so Jesus spits on the ground, he makes some mud, it wipes it on this guy's eyes who's blind, tells him, go to the pool of Siloam and wash. And he goes, he washes, he comes back, starts telling everybody, I was blind, now I see. The neighbors, the people who live in his community are like, we don't know. We don't know about this guy. Maybe he was blind, maybe he's not, we don't know. So they take him to the Pharisees. You guys are the judges, religious things. You guys should be able to figure this out. You figure it out. And the Pharisees ask him what happened, and he was like, I was blind, the guy put mud on my eyes, he told me to go, and I went and washed, now I see. And their first response is, some of them at least, he broke the Sabbath. And so the Pharisees are also divided. Some of them are focused on the fact that they think he broke the Sabbath, and others of them are like, but if he healed this blind guy, what does that say about who he is? So two questions we talked about 2 weeks ago. Does it matter more what we say about Jesus based on a sign that happened, or does it matter more what we say about Jesus based on the laws of the day that they think he violated? And we talked about that a couple weeks ago. The blind man concludes at the end of the section that we finished 2 weeks ago, Jesus is a prophet. So at the very least, the blind man is convinced, I was blind from birth, now I see. And that means one of either two things. Either at the very least, Jesus is a prophet, much like Elisha in 2 Kings chapter 6, who prays to God and God blinds the Syrian army, and then he prays to God again, and God unblinds the Syrian army. Or, at most, Jesus is the Messiah. He is the servant of God from Isaiah chapter 42. The blind man doesn't know that at this point. All he knows at this point in chapter 9, verse 17, is that this guy's at the very least a prophet, because I was blind and now I see. So that's the conclusion he makes. So when we pick up, we're going to see the rest of this section in John chapter 9, not the whole rest of the chapter, but the rest of this section is the continued investigation. So what do the Pharisees go about doing in responding to this man? How do they try and figure out whether he's telling the truth, not telling the truth? And then their reaction, the blind man's reaction, and the conclusion. We're going to cover all that today. So remember that the goal of chapter 9 is not specifically to talk about physical blindness. There's something much deeper going on. One thing I want you to notice as we go is that we don't live in a world that's much different today as what's happening in this story. We don't live in a world that's much different than the Pharisees make this world, or than the blind man makes this world, or than Jesus makes this world. So just connect with me as we go in and out of the text and then back to where we're living today, and we'll cover the rest of this story. So starting in verse 18, where we left off a couple weeks ago, here's the rest of the investigation, the rest of the reaction, the conclusion between the Pharisees and this blind man. Verse 18, the Jews did not believe that he had been blind and received his sight until they called the parents of him who had received sight. So I want to point out to you that one very important word in verse 18 was that they did not believe until they had called his parents. So what that tells us, and it's going to be important later on as we see the Pharisees' response to the blind man, what that tells us is that at some point the Pharisees actually believed, based on the testimony of this blind man's parents, that this guy was blind and now he has sight. And that is going to be something that they reject attributing to Jesus, or they don't want to go there and believe that. But at some point, the Pharisees don't have any other thing but to conclude this guy was blind and now he sees. They don't want to attribute that to Jesus, but just note that as we keep going in the story. And here's the three questions they asked the blind man in their investigation. Verse 19. So the Pharisees, they asked them. The Pharisees bring in the parents, and they're now questioning the parents. Verse 19. And they asked them, is this your son? First question. Who you say was born blind? Second question. And the third question, how then does he now see? So is this your son? Was he born blind? And then how does he now see? And the answer to the first two questions is in verse 20. The answer is essentially yes. His parents answered, we know that this is our son. Yes. And we know that he was born blind. Yes. So they affirm these two things. The Pharisees at this point cannot deny that. This guy was born blind and now he sees. The question then becomes the major question, which is the third question, how then does he see? And this is the answer that, if you were at church last week, Roger said they basically threw him under the bus. And they did. It's verse 21 here, the answer to the third question. But how he now sees, we do not know, nor do we know who opened his eyes. Ask him, he is of age. He will speak for himself. Now, did the parents know exactly what was going on with their son at this point, or had they heard the story about how he received sight? Maybe, maybe not. This seems to all have happened pretty quick. Maybe the blind man had a chance to go home and tell his parents what had happened. Maybe he didn't. I don't know. So maybe they're being honest when they say, we don't know how he received his sight, and the only thing they can confirm is, yes, this is our son. Yes, he was born blind. Maybe they do know, and they're pleading the fifth. Maybe they do know, and they're lying, and they're saying, we don't know, because they don't really want to have anything to do with it. Whatever they're doing, they're putting the onus back on their son. The legal age to testify in a court is 13 years old, so we know in the Jewish community that this man is at least 13 years old. Probably the fact that the parents had to be called in to the Pharisees meaning the parents weren't there when this man had this experience, went to the pool and washed, came all the way back, started telling the neighbors. The fact that the Pharisees still have to bring in the parents probably means they weren't around, probably means they were convinced that this blind man could live on his own, probably means he's an older blind man, probably not close to 13, maybe a little bit older. The other thing is that in the following statements, John will tell us that there's a specific reason that the parents say what they do and respond the way that they do. And so the parents are obviously also aware that this guy could be excommunicated if he tells the truth about who Jesus is or who he thinks Jesus is. So the fact that they are also kind of hands-off in the sense of our son could potentially be excommunicated from the synagogue, and we're just going to let him walk into that if he wants to, also probably tells us that the guy's a little bit older. They have some confidence that if they let him do whatever he wants, he chooses to follow Jesus, he gets kicked out of the synagogue, he's going to be able to survive on his own. They're not taking that responsibility for him. So all just things to tell me the guy's probably a little bit older. He has parents that are still alive, so not horribly old, but somewhat old. Here's the reason. Here's the reason the parents give the answer that they do. This is John's commentary in verse 22. His parents said these things because they feared the Jews. For the Jews had already agreed that if anyone should confess Jesus to be the Christ, he was to be put out of the synagogue. Therefore his parents said, "He is of age, ask him." And these are the verses that I read where I think to myself, or we have not changed that much. Because a lot of people in the world today have the same mindset as the Pharisees when it comes to Jesus. We've already made up our mind, essentially. We don't care what the facts are. We don't care about the evidence. We don't care if there's signs. We're not really committed to right or wrong, some sort of objective truth. We don't care about people's testimonies, what they say about what they experienced with God. Who really cares? They've already made up their minds about who Jesus is. And it doesn't really matter what this blind man says. He could say, "I saw a vision from heaven," and I saw Jesus with God, and he could probably tell them that. They've already simply made up their minds. This is what the parents already know, and the reason why they give the response that they do. If you're a Christian, the reason I point that out is because you need to understand that there may be some people that you try to reach out to. There may be some people that you try to share your testimony with, share the truth with, and they simply do not care. They don't care to evaluate the evidence. They don't want to talk about the facts. They've already made up their mind about who Jesus is. I don't want to dissuade you from sharing your story, but I do want to tell you to be very careful who you use your breath on to share the gospel with. Because the person that's already made up their mind about who Jesus is, it may be a waste. There may be someone close to you who wants to hear about the gospel, who's ready to receive it. They may be the one that you need to spend your time speaking to. I'll give you an example. There's been people here at the church. I'll be in here during the week, and there'll be people who call in, and they'll call in, they'll talk to Julie at the front desk or Ira, and they'll say, "I just need to talk to a pastor." And they say, "Okay." And they forward me a phone call, and "This is so-and-so. You know anything about them?" "No, I don't know anything about them. They just want to talk to a pastor." "Okay, no problem." And I start talking to them, and maybe 1 or 2 minutes in, it becomes evidently clear that they just want to tear down either the Bible or the Trinity or Orthodox beliefs about different hot topics, and they just want to spew whatever it is they want to spew. They're not looking to have a conversation. They're not looking to evaluate the scriptures. They already have in their mind made up what they believe, what they don't believe, what they are trying to get me to believe by calling in and talking with a pastor. And I'll usually listen for a little while. I'll maybe try to interject a couple times. If it doesn't work, at some point when they pause, I'll ask them, are you wanting to have a conversation about these things, or are you just wanting to tell me what you believe? Most of the time, they don't want to admit that they just want to tell me what they believe. So they'll say, "Oh yeah, I want to have a conversation." And it'll be like, "Okay, well, I haven't most of the time in a conversation, two people talk back and forth, and there's some interaction and some discussion, and you're just firing stuff at me. I haven't said anything yet, so if we want to have a discussion about this, we can. Oh, yeah, I'll be quiet. I even had one guy say, okay, one more thing, and then I'll be quiet, and I'll never say anything. And as soon as I, said 3 words, then it was rah, 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 again. And there have been multiple people that have called in like that I will go through that process with, say, hey, if this is going to be a conversation, that's great. If you just want to tell me how wrong I am about all the things that I believe, I'm not really interested in talking about that or listening to you tell me about that. And so then at that point, when they interrupt again and they want to just go on about how horrible my beliefs are and how they're not possibly true and all these sorts of things, most of the time it's, okay, thanks, bye, click. Because these people, they do not want to believe. They've made up their minds already. They're not interested in the evidence. And at some point, you have to draw a line in the sand that says, I'm not going to waste my time with someone who wants to give me lies. It's not healthy for me. It's not healthy for them to be able to have a sounding board to continue to spew lies. Someone who's willing to call and have a conversation and talk about who Jesus really is, I would talk for hours with. Because I have probably just as many questions as they do. Or if not, I've asked them in the past. But be careful when you're going and sharing the truth or you're attempting to share your story. Be careful spending too much time with people who have already made up their minds. Because they can drag you into a pretty dark hole of bitterness and anger. Just be careful. You may have to just distance yourself and say, I'm not having this conversation, which typically is not normally a conversation at that point. Here's how you might want to think about that. Because I know there's some people that really struggle with that. If I don't share with them the gospel, if I don't sit and listen to everything that they have to say, if I don't really get close to them, how are they ever going to hear the gospel? The reality is that you're not the only one that God could use to speak to this person. I had to learn that. And also this instruction that God gave to his disciples is helpful to me as well. This is from Matthew chapter 10. This is Jesus sending out his disciples, and he tells them this when he sends them out. Whatever town or village you enter, find out who is worthy in it, and stay there until you depart. As you enter the house, greet it. If the house is worthy, let your peace come upon it. If it is not worthy, listen to what he says. Let your peace return to you. If anyone will not receive you or listen to your words, shake off the dust from your feet when you leave this town or house. And here's what you end up doing in that moment, which is you give that person back to God and you say, they will not listen to what I have to say. You hand them back over to God and you say, God, you be the judge. If you want to bring someone else into their life to open them up and let them hear the true gospel, then do that. And if it comes to this, then you would be the God who judges. Truly, he says, I say to you, this is Jesus still, it will be more bearable on the day of judgment for the land of Sodom and Gomorrah than for that town, the one who rejects the gospel, the disciples who have the truth. So at some point we have to let our peace return to us and say we did what we could, but God has to take care of this person. Let God be cared for about their salvation. Let him care for their judgment, and you shake the dust from your feet. If you're a skeptic, if you are someone who thinks you've already made up your mind about who Jesus is, I would caution you to be careful that you do not make your decisions before you have all the evidence. Don't be a fool. Don't be the person who thinks they can see when they're really blind. Here's round 2. The Pharisees are going to go back to the blind man. They went to the parents. The parents said, this is our son. He was born blind. Now he sees. Okay, so the Pharisees have acknowledged that. They're going to go round 2 with the blind man. They're going to bring him back up onto the stand, if you will. If the Pharisees are the judge, which is the position that they're very much taking, They've heard the story of the witness, and now they took off the witness, who was the blind man. They brought up his parents. What do you think? Okay, now put back down the parents. Now bring back up the blind man. Round 2. Go back for questioning. This time, they're going to do it with some sort of hostility. It's going to try to pressure the blind man. Essentially, it's spiritual abuse. This is what it looks like here in John chapter 9. So for the second time, verse 24, they called the man who had been blind and said to him, notice how they use their spiritual authority here to abuse, "Give glory to God. We know this man is a sinner." They're essentially telling the blind man to tell the truth. The irony is that he is telling the truth, and the truth is the exact thing that they reject. But in their blindness, they don't see any of that. They don't see the fact that he's telling them the truth and that they're too blind to see it. And the reason is because they're blind. That's the irony. If you are a Christian, can I encourage you that you don't have to give up on the truth that you do know just because you don't know all the truth? Let me read the next verse. This is the blind man's answer, verse 25. "Whether he is a sinner or not, I do not know. One thing I do know, that though I was blind, now I see." It can be a temptation when a skeptic comes and coming at you with all these different things that, to be honest, how many of us are sure about or ready to answer all the questions that our Jehovah's Witness friends have about the deity of Christ and all the different verses they'll walk us to. And it can be tempting in that moment to throw it all out. Well, if I don't know the answer to this truth, then I don't know the answer to XYZ other truth. But the blind man doesn't do that. He says, about this truth, I'm not really sure. But he holds on to what he does know. I don't know if he's a sinner or not. I don't know that much about him. What I do know is that I was blind and now I see. So he doesn't throw the baby out with the bathwater, which is what skeptics will do when they're trying to question you about things. They want you to be questioning these things over here and expect that everything else for you fall apart. But it doesn't have to be that way. You can hold on to the truth that you do know, even if you don't know every truth. Now they're going to give him one more chance to give the right answer. Verse 26, they said to him, "What did he do to you? How did he open your eyes?" One more chance, essentially, to give the answer that they are expecting, which, like I said, is ironic because he's going to tell them the truth, or he already has, and they want him to tell them desperately something besides the truth. So this is exactly what he's going to tell them. Verse 27. This is where my enjoyment of the blind man grows, because this is feisty blind man. This is sassy blind man. He's going to fire back. He's not going to sit and take their garbage, their questioning, their attempt to get him to affirm what is false. Verse 27. He answered them, "I have told you already, and you would not listen. Why do you want to hear it again? Do you also want to become his disciples?" And he just fires away. He's not rattled by their badgering of him. You may speak with someone who doesn't believe, and they may have questions for you, and it may seem like it's going well, and then a little while later they come back, and then they got more questions and more hostility, just like this blind man. Originally, he just got up and shared his testimony, and they were like, "Okay, we'll go do some more digging." And then they went and did some more digging, and by the time they come back to him, now they're hostile. And you may have to not let that rattle you. If someone who's a skeptic or doesn't believe in Jesus comes back and has more questions and is a little bit more hostile, he's not rattled, even though he doesn't know all the answers. Here's their response. They reviled him, saying, "You are a disciple. You are his disciple, but we are disciples of Moses." We don't have enough time to cover it, but you may want to write next to verse 28, John chapter 5, verse 45 and 47, 45 through 47. They clearly admit here that they're disciples of Moses, which is fascinating because Jesus has already told them that if you were a disciple of Moses, you would believe me, because Moses wrote about me. He already addresses with them that they're not really disciples of Moses, because if they were, they would recognize him. Something that they admit here very clearly. That happened the last time Jesus was at the festival. And then the Pharisees then admit again exactly what Jesus has already said, verse 29. We know that God has spoken to Moses, but as for this man, we do not know where he comes from. You might want to write John 8:14 next to verse 29. Because, again, Jesus has already said this maybe a day before, maybe the day before. He said, you don't know where I come from. And here, then, the very next day, they admit to the blind man, we have no idea where this man comes from. So, by their own admission, Jesus knows them very, very well, it would seem. Here's the continued sassy blind man, a little bit feisty here. The man answered, why, this is an amazing thing. You do not know where he comes from, yet he opened my eyes. We know that God does not listen to sinners, but if anyone is a worshiper of God and does his will, God listens to him. Never since the world began has it been heard that anyone opened the eyes of a man born blind. If this man were not from God, he could do nothing. So here's the logic of the blind man. He defines a sinner as someone who does not worship God or do his will. So in other words, those who do worship God and do his will, he would define as not sinners. That can be a little bit confusing in this passage, but just understand, define sinner the same way that the blind man does, so you don't get confused in this passage. If a person does not worship God and does not seek to do his will, then he would then not allow him to do a miracle like this. That's the blind man's logic. You're not following after God, you're not doing his will, then you're doing something contrary to his will. And if healing a blind man from birth is contrary to God's will, then he wouldn't let you do it, because God only allows the things that are for his will. And then in verse 32, essentially, not just any miracle. It's not just like, oh, it's something that God allowed to happen. This is not just any miracle. It's a miracle that's only attributed, as we talked about 2 weeks ago, to the servant of God in Isaiah chapter 42. The blind man points out that no one else has ever performed a miracle like this, healing a man born blind, and that's true. Go try to find otherwise. I know I did. I couldn't find it. And then so the conclusion of the blind man then is this man must be from God. So listen then to the Pharisees' response. This will be the last verse we cover today. They answered him, you were born in utter sin, and would you teach us? And they cast him out. So all throughout this story, there's irony in the different responses of the Pharisees. The Pharisees affirm the exact things that Jesus has just told them, either at the last festival or just the very day before this. They're trying to get the blind man to glorify God, which in fact he is doing by telling the truth. They specifically accuse Jesus of something that he's not, which is a sinner, which they haven't yet been able to prove. And then the irony of this description of the blind man, you were born in utter sin, is that in one sense it's true, and in another sense it's not at all what they intended. What they intended was the same thing that the disciples intended at the beginning of the story, which is who sinned that this man would be born blind, him or his parents. So when they say to him, you were born in utter sin, they're going back to the same reasoning that the disciples had when they questioned Jesus at the very beginning of the chapter, which is, you were born in utter sin because either your parents were sinners or you're a sinner. But the irony of this statement is that it's absolutely also true. Not for the reasons they intended it, but for the reasons that all of us are utterly sinful. The irony is that the Pharisees, the very Pharisees who say this to the blind man, you were born in utter sin, were also born in utter sin. That's the irony. They claim that he was born in utter sin. They're too blind to see that they're also in the same boat, and as a result, cast him out. If the truth is that the Pharisees were born in utter sin, and the blind man was born in utter sin, and you and I are born in utter sin, then what's the difference between the blind man who gets healed and the Pharisees who reject Christ? And the difference is blindness. It's the whole point of the background of the story. Jesus doesn't just, it's cool that Jesus comes, heals a blind man, and no one else has ever done that before. That's a cool story. But the point is that you and I would understand that we're all born in utter sin. All of us. The Pharisees who cast him out, the blind man, you and I, all of us deserve to be cast out. That's the point. We're all born in utter sin. The difference is the people who realize that they're born in utter sin, which is the blind man, and the people who don't realize that they were actually born in utter sin too. Not just because our parents sinned, not just because we sinned, but because of original sin, because sin is passed down through Adam and Eve. They were our representative. Here's a warning to people who are blind. Jesus says this to the Pharisees in Matthew chapter 23. He says this, "Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites! You clean the outside of the cup and of the dish, but inside you are full of robbery and self-indulgence." Listen to the next phrase. "You blind Pharisee, first clean the inside of the cup and of the dish, so that the outside may become clean also." That's what the Pharisees don't understand. The man who is born blind knows that he's blind. Not just physically blind, spiritually blind. We'll see that next week. When he interacts with Jesus, Jesus tells him who he is, and he responds accordingly. But there's all kinds of Pharisees in the world that don't want to believe the truth. That's why I say that our world is not much changed today. It's similar. There's still people. They may not be the religious elite. They may not be making decisions about what happens all over the world, but there are people today who don't care about the facts of who Jesus is. They've made up their minds already about who God is, and the same people want to cast Christians out, Christianity out, God out, the Bible out of society and out of schools, out of businesses, out of government, law, social media, news, entertainment. Let's just cast Jesus out. Let's cast Christians out. And it's because essentially they've already made up their minds. We shouldn't be surprised by this. I'll tell you one last story of maybe what this might look like, and maybe it will help open your eyes. I have a friend, and I met her, had to be at least 5 years ago now, maybe 6 years ago. And when I met her, found out she was a Christian. I was in seminary at the time, and so she had told me these things. And then I got to hear a little bit more of her story. And her story is that she grew up in the Mormon church, and she grew up in Idaho, and her family was highly involved in the Mormon church. And at some point, she got married, but her husband was not of the LDS faith, never joined the church. And at some point, she asked him, "When are you going to join the church?" And he said this to her. They were living in Arizona at the time. He said, "If you can prove to me why the LDS church is the true church, or the real one, then I'll join." And so she said, "Done." And she went on her way, researching and trying to find a way to prove to her husband that this was truth, the stories were truth, the Book of Mormon was truth, and Joseph Smith is true, all the things that an LDS believer would affirm when they're being converted. And she went on this year-long study, which essentially ended with her conclusion that it was all false. Which is fascinating because her husband, or ex-husband at this point, is not a believer. And yet God used not a believer to challenge her in that faith so that she would do her own research, so that when she would do her own research, she would find out that what she had been taught all her life was false. And the most recent time I talked to her about these things, she said this. I can never go back. And the reason I can never go back is because I'm not blind anymore. There's no way I could ever go back because now I see everything for what it was. She said, when I was in it, I didn't. I was blind. I would just go along and my family would do it. And now, now she goes to family events or spends time with her family and they talk about these things or they talk about the church. And she says, now I just sit there and I go, how could you possibly believe these things? How could you be so blind? And what she feels like sitting there is, I can't go back. Does that mean there's never a temptation? Does that mean there's never a question of her mind of what if all this is true and I'm apostate from the only true church, which is what they now tell her, and pray for her to come back. But what she keeps coming back to again and again was, no, before I was blind. And now something is very, very different in her life, and she can't go back. There's no way to go back once your eyes have been opened. The question is, will you cast out the truth so that you can continue believing a lie? This is what the Pharisees did. The truth is, this was a man born blind whom Jesus healed. But the Pharisees don't want to believe that truth. They'd rather cast it out. Best thing for us to do is not to choose to believe this. We don't care about the facts. We don't care about the evidence. We don't care about the testimony of this man's parents. Because at some point, the Pharisees heard the testimony of the parents and said, well, he was definitely born blind and he definitely now sees. But they rejected the reason why he saw and cast him out. Will you keep believing in a lie and be condemned? This touches so many areas of our life. Will you continue believing a lie about what marriage is supposed to be or not? Will you continue believing a lie about what murder is and is not? Will you continue believing a lie about whether or not people actually go to hell or if we all just die and go to the same place? Will you continue believing a lie about whether the world just spontaneously existed or whether there's a creator God who orchestrated its creation and put everything into motion and lives? It doesn't seem like on the front end, if I asked you, would you cast aside the truth to believe a lie, that anybody would be like, yes. But I think we do it all the time. Would you cast aside the truth that God decides your and my gender, not us? Or would you decide to believe a lie? We have people doing this all around us. And maybe you and I are guilty too. Will you acknowledge that you're blind? I'm blind. That we were born in utter sin. That we need Jesus? Would you cling to the truth? Even if you don't have all the answers. When the skeptic comes questioning and you don't have all the answers, do you just throw all the truth away? Or do you say, well, I don't know about that, but this is what I do know? Maybe that could be a response to someone who comes asking you questions that you don't necessarily know. Will you believe in Jesus? Will you accept the teachings of the Bible? Would you choose to be saved? We're going to talk about what that looks like for the blind man next week, but the question we have to answer today is, are you going to throw away the truth to believe a lie? I don't think any of us want to. The question is, do we do it even though we don't want to? Pray with me. I'll tell you about services coming up tomorrow and next week, and then Scott's going to come up, share a little bit about the songs that he has planned for next weekend. Hopefully he's not going to miss it too, at the concert. Pray with me. God, the temptation all the time is to believe a lie. This is what Satan did with Adam and Eve in the garden. This is the world that we live in. And the question is always, are we going to trust you, the rules that you give us, and the guidelines that you give us for living? Are we going to submit and trust that they are the best, very best plan for our life? Or are we going to take what we know to be truth, cast it aside, and decide to believe a lie? God, I pray you would make us disciples of you in every area of our life, not just the ones that are easy for us, Not just the ones that we think we have figured out, but the ones that you're calling us to be transformed in, changed, and be closer to being what Christ was like. God, thanks for the testimony of the blind man. Thanks for the demonstration of what it looks like to be questioned and cast out and persecuted and unequivocally persistent in the truth. God, I pray you would keep us from being rattled by people who come questioning what we believe, that you would give us firm foundations to stand on, and allow ourselves the time to say, I don't know about that, but this is what I do know, and to stay grounded in those things. God, thanks for the testimony that my friend was able to share. God, I pray that you would continue to use her story to transform people. I know that she's wrestles with being involved, bringing people out of that belief system and how to be involved that way. So God, I pray you'd make abundantly clear to her how her testimony could be used to open the eyes of the blind, to see clearly so that other people could see clearly as her, God. Thanks for opening her eyes and showing her truth. We know that you worked mighty in her life, and we ask that you continue to do that. God, thanks for your message this morning, that we could hear your word and believe it. God, I pray for people who are on the fence. Bring them into your fold. Open their eyes. Open their eyes in such a way that their response is, I can never go back. I cannot be changed because I've seen too much. God, thank you for doing this in all of our lives. And thank you for your son. I pray this in Jesus' name. Amen.